Mom, Dad changed the locks. For a second I thought I'd heard my 10-year-old daughter wrong. The words didn't make sense. I was sitting at my desk inside the administrative building on base finishing paperwork that should have been completed before lunch. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A stack of reports sat beside my keyboard. Outside my office window, soldiers moved between buildings under the warm Friday afternoon sun. Everything had felt normal. Then my phone rang, and my daughter's voice shattered that normalcy. "Mom," she sobbed. "Dad changed the locks." I stood up so quickly my chair rolled backward into the wall. "Emily, slow down," I said, forcing calm into my voice. Years in the army had taught me that panic never solved anything. "Tell me exactly what's happening." There was a sniffle, then another. "I'm outside." My stomach dropped. "Outside where?" "Dad's house." I closed my eyes. My ex-husband's house, the house where our daughter was supposed to be spending the weekend under our court-approved parenting agreement. The house where she had slept hundreds of nights before. The house she still called home. "What do you mean you're outside?" I asked carefully. "I came back from Sarah's house. Her best friend lived 3 blocks away. I tried my key." She started crying harder. "It doesn't work anymore." The room suddenly felt very small. "Where's your father?" "I don't know." "Did you call him?" "Lots of times." "Did he answer?" "No." I looked at the clock. Just after 4 in the afternoon. A 10-year-old child alone outside a locked house. My daughter. "Stay right where you are," I said. "I'm coming." "Okay." Her voice was tiny, fragile, like she was trying very hard not to completely fall apart. I hung up and immediately called my commanding officer. One thing I've learned after nearly 15 years in the Army is that emergencies don't wait for convenient timing. Fortunately, my commander understood. Within minutes, I was walking across the parking lot toward my truck. As I climbed inside, anger tried to take hold. I pushed it aside. Right now, Emily mattered. Not my feelings. Not my ex-husband. Just Emily. The drive home normally took a little over an hour. That afternoon it felt endless. As the miles passed beneath my tires, old memories surfaced. When David and I divorced 3 years earlier, we'd promised each other that Emily would never be caught in the middle. For a while we'd managed. Birthdays, school events, soccer games, parent-teacher conferences. We weren't friends, but we were civil. Then he got engaged. Everything changed after that. His fiancée Rachel was younger than him by nearly 10 years. At first, I genuinely tried to make her feel welcome. But little things started happening. Emily would mention that Rachel didn't like children's movies. Rachel wanted adult weekends. Rachel thought Emily was too dependent on her father. Comments that sounded harmless individually. Together, they painted a different picture. A picture I didn't want to believe. The closer I got to David's neighborhood, the tighter my grip became on the steering wheel. Please let her be okay. Please let this all be some misunderstanding. But deep down I already knew. Mothers know. When I turned onto his street, I spotted her immediately. My daughter sat alone on the front steps. A small pink backpack rested beside her. The same backpack she'd taken for the weekend. Her shoulders were slumped. Her head was down. She looked impossibly small. I parked and got out before the engine fully stopped. "Emily?" She looked up. The moment she saw me, she ran. I dropped to my knees just in time to catch her. She crashed into my arms and held on with everything she had. I could feel her trembling. "It's okay," I whispered. "I'm here." She buried her face against my shoulder. For several seconds she couldn't speak. Then she finally asked the question that would haunt me long after that day ended. "Mom?" I pulled back enough to look at her. Tears streaked her cheeks. "What is it, sweetheart?" Her lower lip trembled. "What did I do wrong?" The words hit harder than any insult ever could. Not because she was crying. Not because she was scared. Because she believed she had somehow earned this. That broke something inside me. I wrapped my arms around her again. "You did absolutely nothing wrong." I said it firmly. Immediately. Without hesitation. "You hear me?" She nodded weakly. Then the front door opened. David stepped outside. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked uncomfortable. Not guilty. Not ashamed. Just inconvenienced. Rachel appeared behind him. David crossed his arms. "This isn't her home anymore." The words hung in the air. Cold. Deliberate. Cruel. I stared at him. Part of me wanted to argue. To scream. To demand answers. But I looked down at my daughter. She was already hurting enough. So I simply stood up and took her hand. "Let's go." David frowned. "That's it." I met his eyes. "That's it." Emily picked up her backpack. Together we walked away. Neither of us looked back. The sun was setting by the time we got on the highway. Within 20 minutes, exhaustion finally caught up with her. She fell asleep in the passenger seat. Her head rested against the window. One hand still clutched that little backpack, as if she was afraid someone might take that away too. And while she slept, I drove through the gathering darkness with one thought repeating over and over in my mind. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Something far worse had happened. The next morning I woke up before sunrise. Years in the army had trained my body to function on very little sleep, but that night hadn't been about exhaustion. It had been about anger. Not the explosive kind. The quiet kind. The kind that sits in your chest and waits. Emily was still asleep when I walked into the kitchen. For the first time since she was a toddler, she'd asked if she could sleep in my room. I hadn't hesitated. She'd fallen asleep clutching a stuffed rabbit she'd owned since kindergarten. 10 years old. Too old for stuffed animals, some people might say. Not after what she'd gone through. I poured a cup of coffee and stared out the window. Then I opened my notebook. The Army teaches you something important. When emotions are running high, gather facts. Facts don't panic. Facts don't lie. Facts win. I wrote down everything Emily had told me. The time she'd left her friend's house. The time she'd arrived at David's. The unanswered calls. The locked door. His exact words. This isn't her home anymore. Seeing the sentence written on paper made me feel sick. Around 8 o'clock, after Emily woke up and ate breakfast, I drove back to David's neighborhood. Not to confront him. To verify what had happened. The first person I spoke with was Mrs. Henderson, an elderly widow who lived directly across the street. She'd lived there for over 20 years. She knew everything that happened on that block. When she saw me approaching, her expression immediately changed. "Oh, honey," she said softly, "that told me everything. You saw Emily yesterday." Mrs. Henderson nodded. She was out there a long time. My stomach tightened. "How long?" The older woman thought for a moment. "At least 3 hours. 3 hours." I glanced toward David's house. 3 hours. A 10-year-old child sitting alone outside. Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "I almost went over there myself." "Why didn't you—" "Your daughter kept saying her father would come." That hurt even more. Emily had trusted him. Even after being locked out, she'd trusted him to show up. The next neighbor provided even more information. A younger couple named Mark and Jennifer lived 2 houses down. When I explained why I was there, Mark exchanged a glance with his wife. Then he said something unexpected. "We have footage." I blinked. Footage. Our Ring camera. Within minutes we were sitting at their kitchen table reviewing video clips. The timestamps told a devastating story. Emily arrived shortly after 1 o'clock. She tried her key. Again. And again. She knocked. Waited. Knocked harder. Pulled out her phone. Made calls. Sat down. Stood up. Paced. Cried. Waited. The video had no sound. It didn't need any. Every frame felt like a punch to the chest. At one point, she sat on the porch steps and buried her face in her hands. Completely alone. Jennifer reached over and squeezed my arm. "I'm so sorry." I couldn't speak. I simply nodded. Mark transferred copies of the footage to a flash drive. I thanked them and returned to my truck. For several minutes, I just sat there, staring at the steering wheel, trying to process what I'd seen. The evidence removed every possible excuse. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't miscommunication. It wasn't an accident. It was intentional. Back home, I reviewed Emily's phone records. The timestamps matched the video perfectly. 7 unanswered calls. 4 text messages. No response. Then I looked through my own messages. There was nothing from David. Not a single attempt to explain where Emily was. Not a single question about whether she'd made it home safely. Nothing. The parenting agreement sat inside a folder in my office. I pulled it out and read the relevant section twice. His weekend. His responsibility. No ambiguity. No loopholes. No misunderstanding. By noon, I had reached a conclusion. This wasn't a family argument. This was a legal issue. So I called a family attorney. Her name was Linda Matthews, a practical woman with 30 years of experience in family court. I emailed everything. The Ring footage. The phone records. The texts. The parenting agreement. An hour later, we met in her office. She reviewed the evidence carefully. The longer she looked, the more serious her expression became. Finally, she set the documents down. "Captain," she said, "have you shown this to anyone else?" "No." She nodded slowly. "Good." I waited. Then she leaned forward. "What happened here is extremely concerning." Hearing those words from someone who handled custody disputes every day carried weight. "What are my options?" I asked. Linda folded her hands. We file immediately. For the first time since picking Emily up from those steps, I felt something resembling calm. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Direction. A path forward. That evening I signed the paperwork. Emergency custody petition. Supporting evidence. Witness statements. Everything. The following afternoon, less than 24 hours after David had told our daughter she no longer belonged in his home, a process server delivered court papers directly to him. I wasn't there. But later that evening my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen. I answered. What is this? He demanded. You know exactly what it is. There was a short silence. Then he laughed. Actually laughed. A dismissive, irritated laugh. Seriously, you're overreacting. I listened to him for a moment. And for the first time I realized something important. David still didn't understand what he'd done. And that ignorance was about to cost him far more than he imagined. The courthouse was quieter than I expected. Most people imagine dramatic courtroom scenes from television-raised voices, shocking confessions, last-minute revelations. Real family court is different. It's quieter, sadder. Because behind every case file is a family that somehow broke apart. 3 weeks after Emily was locked out, I found myself sitting at a wooden table beside Linda Matthews. Across the room sat David and his attorney. Rachel sat behind him. Neither looked particularly worried. That bothered me. Not because I wanted them to suffer, because they still seemed unable to grasp what had happened. The bailiff called our case. Everyone stood. Then the hearing began. The judge was an older woman with silver hair and a reputation for being fair. She listened carefully as both attorneys introduced themselves. Linda presented our emergency custody request. David's attorney immediately tried to minimize everything. Your Honor, he began, this is an unfortunate misunderstanding that has been exaggerated beyond reason. I felt my jaw tighten. The attorney continued, there was no intent to harm the child. Mr. Harper simply believed his daughter would remain with friends for the evening. Linda didn't react. She simply made a note. The judge looked toward David. Is that your position? Yes, Your Honor. His voice sounded confident. Too confident. It was one night. As if that explained everything. As if a frightened 10-year-old sitting outside a locked house for hours was a scheduling error. Rachel was called to testify next. She smoothed her blouse and sat down. Her testimony was carefully measured, almost rehearsed. Emily has always been very emotional, she said. The judge looked up. What do you mean by that? Rachel smiled politely. She tends to overreact. Linda's pen stopped moving. Rachel continued. When she couldn't get inside, she became dramatic. That word again. Dramatic. The judge's expression remained neutral. But I noticed her writing something down. Then Linda stood. Cross-examination. Ms. Collins, she said calmly, did you know the locks had been changed? Rachel hesitated. Yes. Did Emily know? No. Did anyone inform her? No. Did anyone provide her with a key? No. A pause. Did anyone answer her phone calls? Rachel shifted in her seat. No. The courtroom became very quiet. Linda nodded. No further questions. Then came David. He took the stand looking irritated rather than concerned. As if being there was an inconvenience, Linda asked him a simple question. When did you realize your daughter was outside the home? Later that afternoon. And what did you do? I assumed she'd call her mother. Several people in the courtroom glanced up, including the judge. Linda remained calm. You assumed? Yes. Did you verify her safety? No. Did you answer any of her calls? No. Did you return any of her messages? No. Every answer sounded worse than the last. Yet David seemed unaware of it. Then Linda said the words I'd been waiting to hear. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Petitioner's Exhibit 1. The ring camera footage. The monitor flickered to life. The courtroom watched. Emily walking up to the door. Trying her key. Trying it again. Knocking. Waiting. Calling. Sitting down. Crying. Hours passing. No one moved. No one spoke. The timestamps told the story more effectively than any attorney could. Then came Exhibit 2. Phone records. 7 unanswered calls. 4 unanswered texts. Exhibit 3. Neighbor statements. Mrs. Henderson's written testimony. Mark and Jennifer's testimony. Exhibit 4. The parenting agreement. Clear language. Clear responsibility. Then Linda introduced something I hadn't seen before. Weather records. The judge raised an eyebrow. Linda explained. The temperature dropped significantly during the hours the child remained outside. The judge studied the document. Another note. Another mark against David. By now his confidence had vanished. For the first time he looked nervous. Then Linda requested permission to play a recorded interview conducted by the court-appointed child specialist. My heart immediately started pounding. I knew what Emily had said. But hearing it again was different. The recording began. Emily appeared on the screen sitting in a small office, her hands folded in her lap, her voice barely above a whisper. The specialist asked a gentle question. "What were you thinking while you were sitting outside?" Emily stared at the floor. Then she answered, "I thought Daddy didn't love me anymore." Silence. Complete silence. I looked down, not because I was ashamed, because hearing it still hurt. Across the room, David's face had gone pale. The specialist asked another question. "Why did you think that—" Emily swallowed. "Because he left me outside." The recording ended. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The judge removed her glasses. She sat quietly for several moments reviewing her notes. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured and firm. "The evidence presented today is deeply troubling." David stared at the table. "The court's primary obligation is the safety and emotional well-being of the child." She looked directly at him. "What occurred here was not a misunderstanding." His attorney lowered his head. The judge continued. "Effective immediately emergency temporary custody is granted to the mother." A sharp breath escaped Rachel. David looked stunned, as if he genuinely hadn't expected consequences. The hearing continued for several more minutes, but I barely heard any of it. Because one thing had become painfully clear. The judge understood exactly what this case was really about. Not locks. Not custody schedules. Not legal paperwork. A little girl had been made to feel unwanted. And for the first time since that terrible afternoon, someone in authority had finally said what needed to be said. David's actions mattered. And now he was going to have to live with the consequences. Months passed. Then nearly a year. Life didn't magically become easier after the custody ruling. In some ways it became harder. Court orders can change living arrangements. They can't instantly heal a child's heart. The judge's decision gave me temporary custody that later became permanent primary custody. David was granted supervised visitation while the court monitored the situation. I never celebrated. Some people expected me to. A few friends even said things like, "You won." But sitting across from your daughter while she struggles to understand why her father rejected her doesn't feel like winning. It feels like damage control. The first few months were especially difficult. Emily stopped sleeping through the night. She'd wake up crying from nightmares she couldn't fully explain. Sometimes I'd hear her footsteps in the hallway around 2 a.m. I'd open my bedroom door and find her standing there, not saying anything, just needing reassurance that someone was home. Someone wasn't going to leave her outside. Every single time I welcomed her in. One night she quietly asked a question that broke my heart. "Mom?" "Yes, sweetheart." "If people stop loving someone, do they tell them—" I set my book aside. "Why are you asking—" She stared at the blanket. "I don't know." But I knew. The lock. The porch. The silence. All of it was still living inside her. I pulled her close. "Real love doesn't disappear because things get difficult." She didn't answer. But she relaxed enough to fall asleep. The following week therapy began. At first she hated it. She barely spoke during sessions. She answered questions with shrugs and one-word responses. But her therapist, Dr. Reynolds, was patient. Very patient. Slowly, little by little, Emily started opening up. The changes weren't dramatic. They happened in tiny moments. She laughed more often. She stopped checking the front door repeatedly before bed. She began making plans with friends again. Most importantly, she started talking about the future. For a while, she'd seemed afraid to do that, as if planning ahead might lead to disappointment. Meanwhile, David's life was changing too. Not in the way he'd imagined. Word spread, not through gossip, through reality. Family court records aren't exciting dinner conversation, but people talk, especially when children are involved. Several mutual friends quietly distanced themselves. People who had once defended him stopped making excuses. Even his own brother called me one afternoon. "I don't know what happened to him," he said. Neither did I. Or maybe I did. Sometimes people convince themselves they're pursuing happiness when they're really running from responsibility. Rachel didn't stay long. About 8 months after the hearing, their engagement ended. I heard about it through mutual acquaintances. I felt no satisfaction. Just sadness. A family had been destroyed. Not because of one mistake, because of a series of choices. David continued attending supervised visits. At first, Emily dreaded them. Then she tolerated them. Eventually, she stopped talking much about them at all. That worried me more than anger would have. Anger means you still care enough to fight. Indifference is different. Indifference is distance. And distance had started growing between them. One spring afternoon, nearly 2 years after the incident, I sat in the bleachers watching Emily play soccer. The sun was warm. Parents cheered from the sidelines. Kids laughed. Normal life. Beautifully normal. Emily had joined the team again several months earlier. The first time she'd quit after the lockout. Now she was back. Running. Smiling. Shouting instructions to teammates. Looking like herself again. Maybe even stronger. After the game, she jogged over carrying her water bottle. Her cheeks were red from exertion. "Did you see that pass?" "I did. It was pretty good." "It was excellent," she grinned. The grin of a child who was finally beginning to trust happiness again. That evening we stopped for ice cream. Nothing special. Just one of those ordinary moments parents remember forever. We sat outside watching traffic pass. Then Emily suddenly spoke. "Mom?" "Yeah." She stared at her melting ice cream. "I know I wasn't the problem." The words hit me so unexpectedly that I couldn't respond right away. For years I'd worried about the damage done that afternoon. Wondered whether some part of her would always blame herself. And now, sitting across from me in a little ice cream shop, she had answered that fear. "I know I wasn't the problem," she repeated. A tear slipped down my cheek before I could stop it. She smiled. A small smile. A knowing smile. As if she understood exactly why I was crying. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Neither of us spoke for a moment. We didn't need to. Some victories don't happen in courtrooms. They happen when a child finally believes she is worthy of love. A few months later, an email arrived from David's attorney. Short. Professional. Unexpected. David was requesting one final meeting. Not another custody hearing. Not a visitation adjustment. A meeting. Just the three of us. After everything that had happened, I wasn't sure what he could possibly have left to say. But something told me this conversation would be different from all the others, and for the first time in years, David seemed ready to face the truth. Years passed before that meeting finally happened. Life has a way of moving forward even when old wounds remain. Emily grew taller, more confident, more independent. The frightened little girl who once sat alone on a porch with a backpack eventually became a young woman preparing to start high school. She made honor roll, played soccer, built close friendships, and little by little she created a life that was no longer defined by one terrible afternoon. The lockout never disappeared from our memories, but it stopped controlling them. That alone felt like a blessing. The request for a meeting came shortly before Emily's freshman year began. By then, David's supervised visitation requirements had long since ended, though their relationship remained distant. Polite, careful, never quite comfortable. When I asked Emily whether she wanted to go, I made it clear the choice was hers. "No pressure," I told her. "If you don't want to see him, we won't." She thought about it for nearly a week. Then one evening, she came into the kitchen while I was making dinner. "I'll go." "You sure?" She nodded. "I think so." There was no anger in her voice. No excitement either. Just maturity. The kind children sometimes develop when life forces them to grow up too quickly. The meeting took place in a small private room at a local restaurant. Neutral ground. No lawyers. No court officials. No judges. Just 3 people connected by a history none of us could change. David was already there when we arrived. For a moment I barely recognized him. He looked older than his years, not physically. Emotionally. Like someone who had spent a long time carrying regret. He stood when Emily entered. His eyes immediately filled with tears. She offered a polite smile and sat down. I sat beside her. For several moments nobody spoke. Finally, David cleared his throat. "Thank you for coming." Emily nodded. The silence returned. Then he took a deep breath. And to his credit, he did something I hadn't expected. He told the truth. No excuses, no blame. No attempts to rewrite history. Just the truth. "I spent years trying to convince myself I had reasons," he said quietly. His hands trembled slightly. "I told myself I was overwhelmed." He looked down. "I told myself I deserved a fresh start." Another pause. "I told myself having less responsibility would make everyone happier." Emily listened without interrupting. "So many lies," he continued. "The biggest one was pretending what happened wasn't a big deal." I watched my daughter carefully. She remained calm, attentive, strong. David swallowed hard. "The truth is simpler." His voice cracked. "I chose convenience over fatherhood." Nobody spoke. Because there was nothing to add. That sentence said everything. He wiped at his eyes. I failed you. This time he was looking directly at Emily. I failed you in the worst way a parent can fail a child. Tears rolled down his face. I can't change what I did. Emily remained silent. I can't take back that day. His shoulders slumped. And I know I don't deserve forgiveness. For the first time since the meeting began, Emily spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, almost gentle. I appreciate you saying that. David looked up. Hope flickered briefly across his face. Then Emily continued. I forgive you. A tear slipped down his cheek. But before he could speak, she added something else. Something honest. Something earned. But I'll never forget that day. The room became very still. David closed his eyes. Then he nodded. Not arguing. Not defending himself. Simply accepting the truth. Because some consequences don't end when court cases close. Some consequences live in memory. And memory can last a lifetime. The conversation continued for another hour. They talked about school, future plans, soccer, ordinary things. The kind of conversation families should have had years earlier. When we finally stood to leave, David hugged Emily. She returned the hug politely, warmly even, but not completely. Some bridges can be rebuilt. Others remain permanently altered. And that's part of life too. As we walked toward the parking lot, Emily slipped her arm through mine, the same way she had when she was little. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled. A genuine smile. The kind that told me she was at peace. Not because everything had been repaired. Because she no longer needed it to be. That night after she went to bed, I sat alone on the back porch and reflected on everything that had happened. The court case. The therapy. The years of healing. The apology. The forgiveness. And I realized something important. Justice was never about punishing David. It was about protecting a little girl's belief that she mattered. That she was worthy of love. That she belonged. Because a child may forget many birthdays and gifts, but they never forget the day a parent made them feel unwanted, or the parent who came for them without hesitation. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to tell someone you love that they'll always have a place in your life. And if you've experienced something similar, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Stories like these remind us how much our choices matter. Thank you for spending this time with me, and if you'd like to hear more real-life stories about family resilience and second chances, please consider subscribing.